I'm sitting in the shadows of my own dining room, clutching a cold cup of tea, while my 3 children sit at my mahogany table with a yellow highlighter, marking my life away like they're at a garage sale. They think I can't hear them because they bought me those expensive hearing aids last year, but they forgot one thing. I turn them off when I want to hear what people really think. My oldest son is currently arguing with his wife about who gets the lake house, while my youngest daughter is already listing my jewelry on her phone. They're talking about me in the past tense, planning which luxury nursing home will keep me out of their sight while they spend the millions my late husband and I bled for. But as they laugh about who gets the good silver, they have no idea that the woman they're treating like a ghost is about to haunt them while she's still breathing. Why did I find a change of power of attorney form in the trash with a signature that isn't mine? What is the secret debt my son is hiding that makes him so desperate to sell my home? And most importantly, who is the man currently waiting in my driveway with a set of legal papers that will leave all 3 of them with exactly 0? You need to watch this entire story until the final second to understand the reality of what happens when you underestimate a 71-year-old woman with nothing left to lose. Before we start, if you are new to this channel, please subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from so I can see how far my voice is going. At 71, I have learned that the loudest sounds are often the ones people think you can't hear. I sat in the wingback chair in the library, the door slightly ajar, listening to the clink of ice in crystal glasses I had hand-washed for 40 years. My children, Marcus, Tasha, and Andre, were in the next room, and they weren't talking about my health or my happiness. They were talking about liquidation. Marcus, my eldest, was leading the charge, his voice clinical as he explained to his siblings that the house was too much for a woman of my age to maintain. He spoke as if I were a piece of furniture that had become an eyesore, a liability to be managed. Tasha was already talking about the aesthetic of the estate and how much she could get for the vintage art collection my husband, Silas, had gifted me before he passed. They hadn't asked me if I wanted to leave. They were simply deciding that I was gone. But as I sat there, I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me, and I reached for the burner phone Silas told me never to use unless the vultures finally arrived. I watched them through the crack in the door as they pulled out the floor plans for the house, marking rooms for renovation as if I were already in the ground. Andre, the baby of the family, seemed hesitant, but Marcus quickly shut him down, mentioning a joint investment they had all made that was currently underwater. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't just moving me for my own good. They had gambled away their own lives and were now looking to mine as a bailout. I checked the drawer of Silas's old desk and found that my passport was missing, along with the title to the car. They were systematically stripping away my mobility, preparing to trap me in a legal cage before I even realized the door was shut. I used the burner phone to call a number I hadn't dialed in 20 years, a man named Elias who handled the shadow side of Silas's business. I told him it was time for the retirement plan to be activated, and his only response was, "Are you sure? There's no going back once they see the truth." The next morning, Marcus arrived with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, carrying a stack of medical evaluations he wanted me to sign, just for insurance purposes. I played the part of the confused, aging mother, letting my hand shake as I held the pen, watching his eyes light up with predatory greed. He didn't realize that I had spent the night installing hidden cameras in the living room, capturing every whispered conversation between him and the shady lawyer he had brought over. They discussed a competency hearing scheduled for the following week, one they intended to win by using the very medications they were forcing me to take. I realized then that they weren't just taking my money. They were willing to chemically lobotomize me to ensure I couldn't fight back in court. But as Marcus leaned in to kiss my cheek, I smelled the expensive cigar smoke of the man he had been meeting in secret, the same man Silas had warned me was our greatest rival. I waited until Marcus left before I went to the attic, moving a heavy trunk to reveal a safe hidden behind the insulation. A safe even Silas didn't know I had. Inside wasn't just cash. It was a ledger of every loan I had given my children over the last decade, with their signatures on every page, promising to repay the estate upon Silas's death. They had forgotten these debts, thinking that as their mother, I would never hold them accountable, but I had kept every receipt. I also found a flash drive labeled The Bridge, containing a recording Silas made on his deathbed, revealing the true source of Marcus's business success. My son hadn't built anything. He had been stealing from the family trust for years, and Tasha and Andre had been helping him cover the tracks. I realized the liquidation wasn't just about greed. It was a desperate attempt to hide the fact that they had already stolen millions before I even turned 70. I was about to leave the attic when the light from a black sedan hit the driveway, and I saw Marcus greeting a man I hadn't seen in 30 years, my husband's brother, Arthur. Arthur had been banished from the family after Silas caught him embezzling. Yet here he was, hugging my son and handing him a briefcase. I realized the legal documents Marcus wanted me to sign weren't for a nursing home. They were for the transfer of the entire family empire to Arthur. My children weren't just betraying me. They were selling out their father's legacy to the one man he hated most in the world. I felt a surge of adrenaline that defied my 71 years, realizing that the vultures weren't just circling. They were already inside the house. I pulled the flash drive and the ledger, but as I turned to head for the stairs, I heard the heavy click of the attic door locking from the outside. Marcus's voice came through the wood, cold and devoid of any love. "I'm sorry, Mom, but you were always too smart for your own good. We'll tell everyone you got confused and locked yourself in." The heat in the attic began to rise as I realized they had also turned off the ventilation, hoping the accident would happen before the lawyers arrived. I didn't panic. I simply moved to the small window Silas had installed for emergencies, one that led to the service ladder behind the ivy. I climbed down with the agility of a woman half my age, fueled by a rage that burned hotter than the summer sun. I reached the garden and saw Tasha and Andre loading my grandmother's antique silver into their trunks, laughing as if they were on a shopping spree. They didn't see me slip into the back of Marcus's car, hiding under a moving blanket he had intended to use for my furniture. I listened as Marcus and Arthur discussed the final step. They were going to discover me in the attic tomorrow morning, after the papers were already filed. My heart broke for the children I had raised, but the woman I had become wasn't interested in tears. She was interested in a total reset. The car stopped at a high-end law office downtown, and I waited for Marcus to exit before I slipped out and headed for the building across the street. This was where Elias kept his office, a place where the laws of polite society didn't apply and where Silas's real power was stored. Elias looked at me, his eyes taking in my dusty clothes and the fire in my eyes, and he simply handed me a glass of water and a phone. I didn't call the police. I called the bank's fraud department and the lead investigator for the IRS, using the code Silas had left in the ledger. Within an hour, every account associated with my children was frozen, and a stop payment was placed on the sale of the house. I watched from the window as Marcus's phone began to ring incessantly, his face turning from triumph to a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He didn't know that the ghost was already pulling the strings of his financial execution. I returned to the house that evening, not through the attic, but through the front door, walking in like the queen of the castle I still was. Marcus, Tasha, and Andre were in the foyer, screaming at each other about their frozen accounts and the technical glitch that had ruined their day. They froze when they saw me standing there, my hair perfect and my eyes cold, holding the ledger and the flash drive like a judge holding a sentence. I didn't yell. I simply sat in my chair and told them to sit down or the police, who were already waiting in the kitchen, would come out and do it for them. Tasha began to cry, the same fake tears she used to get her way as a child, but I didn't feel a thing as I opened the ledger to the first page of their debts. I told them the liquidation was indeed happening, but it wasn't my life that was being sold, it was theirs. I gave them one choice: sign a full confession of their embezzlement and the plot to sedate me, or spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Arthur had already fled the moment the accounts were frozen, leaving my children to face the consequences of the war he had started. Marcus tried to argue, claiming that the evidence wouldn't hold up in court, until I played the recording of him talking about locking me in the attic. The room went silent, the only sound being the heavy breathing of three adults who realized they had just lost everything to the woman they thought was too old to notice. One by one, they signed the papers, their hands shaking as they realized they were now effectively disinherited and broke. I watched them walk out of my house with nothing but the clothes on their backs, the same way they had tried to leave me. But as the door clicked shut, I realized there was one more secret Silas had kept from me, hidden in the very back of the ledger. The final page of the ledger wasn't a debt. It was a birth certificate for a fourth child. A son Silas had fathered with a woman named Elena, just 2 years before he died. Silas hadn't just been protecting me from the vultures in our family. He had been funding a second family with the money I thought we were saving for our retirement. I realized that my loyal husband had spent his final years living a double life, and Marcus had known about it all along. Marcus hadn't been working with Arthur to steal the house. He had been working to pay off the other family to keep them from suing for their share of the estate. My children weren't just greedy. They were protecting their own inheritance from a half-brother they never told me existed. I sat in the silence of my massive, empty house, realizing that everyone I had ever loved had been lying to me for 30 years. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, worse than the attic or the frozen accounts, as I realized my entire marriage had been a carefully constructed play. I found Elena's address in Silas's private files, a modest house on the other side of town that was paid for in full by our joint savings. I drove there that night, parked across the street, and watched as a young boy, no older than 12, played in the front yard. He had Silas's eyes, the same bright, piercing blue that I used to wake up to every morning, and the way he tilted his head was a mirror of my husband. A woman came out to call him in for dinner, and she looked nothing like the monster I expected. She looked tired, kind, and completely unaware of the war I was fighting. I realized that Silas hadn't just betrayed me. He had left this woman and child in a state of legal limbo that Marcus was about to exploit. I didn't hate her. I hated the man who had left us both to fight over his scraps while he rested in peace. I knocked on the door, and the look of recognition on Elena's face told me that she knew exactly who I was, even if Silas had told her I was difficult or unstable. We sat at her kitchen table, two women who had been loved by the same man, surrounded by the remnants of the life he had stolen from both of us. She showed me letters Silas had written her, promising to leave me and set things right, the same lies he had whispered to me while he was at work. She told me that Marcus had been coming by for months, threatening to evict her and her son if she didn't sign away any claim to the Silas trust. I realized my son wasn't just a thief. He was a bully who was prepared to leave a child homeless to protect his own greed. I looked at the boy, my husband's son, and I knew what I had to do to truly end this cycle of betrayal. I returned home and called Elias, telling him to prepare a new set of documents that would merge the Silas trust with my personal estate. I wasn't going to let my children have a single cent, but I wasn't going to let Silas's secret son suffer for his father's sins either. I set up a trust for the boy that would cover his education and a home, but it was locked under my sole control until he turned 25. When Marcus heard about this, he showed up at my door, screaming that I was betraying my own blood for a bastard. I stood on my porch, looking down at the son I had raised, and told him that blood didn't mean anything if it was filled with poison. I had the police remove him from the property, and as he was led away, he shouted that I would die alone in that big, empty house. But I didn't feel alone. For the first time in 71 years, I felt like the air I was breathing actually belonged to me. I spent the next month clearing out the house, selling the good silver, and the vintage art to fund a foundation for women who had been financially abused by their families. I kept only the things that actually meant something to me, my books, my photos of the early years, and the tea set my mother gave me. I sold the estate to a group that wanted to turn it into a community center, a place where people could gather and find support, rather than a monument to one man's ego. My children tried to sue me, but the confessions they had signed in the foyer were ironclad, and their reputations were in tatters. I moved into a smaller, sunlit apartment near the park, where no one knew my name or the millions I had once managed. I started taking walks every morning, breathing in the fresh air, and for once, I wasn't listening for whispers behind closed doors. A year later, I was sitting on a bench in the park when a man sat down next to me, his presence familiar yet unsettling in a way I couldn't place. He didn't look at me, but he spoke in a low voice, mentioning that Silas hadn't just had one secret family, he had been part of a much larger network. He handed me a folder that contained photos of Silas with men in government uniforms, dated months after his funeral took place. My heart stopped as I realized the casket I had wept over was as empty as the promises Silas had made to me throughout our marriage. The man stood up to leave, but before he did, he whispered that Silas was still alive, living under a new name in a country with no extradition. I looked at the photos, realizing that the retirement plan Silas had left me wasn't a gift. It was a distraction to keep me from looking for him. I stood up, the park blurring around me, as I realized that the real war wasn't with my children, but with the ghost who was still very much alive.